Hi, I'm Sue, the creator of Cut Couture and Cut Couture Kits, pre-cut linen sew-at-home garment making kits with easy-to-follow online instructions. My versatile Helen linen tunic has two possible versions, either with or without a collar. I would strongly suggest that if you're new to sewing clothes, then you follow video 1A, which is the no collar option. Attaching a collar is really quite difficult. If you're an intermediate sewer and maybe you have already attached sleeves into a sleeve head, then maybe you want to consider the collar option, but I would suggest that you watch both video 1A and video 1B before making a decision as to which one is for you. Both options are equally stylish, and if you choose to make the version without the collar, you can use the collar pieces to make a matching scrunchie. So this video 1B relates to the with collar option. Before we start, a few pre-production notes. Seam allowances are 1.5 centimetres unless otherwise advised. Use the magic marker pen where indicated to highlight notches or mark your fabric. It does fade in water or air, so don't worry, it's not going to stain the fabric. Your care label and brand label will dye to match the colour of your garment if you decide to garment dye. So if you're going to dye a dark colour, I suggest that you attach these after dyeing. As linen is a natural fabric, you will find natural slubs and flecks in the fabric. These are to be considered characteristic of the fabric and are not defects. And you have been supplied with a reel of natural cotton sewing thread. This will also dye to match your garment, so please do use this and not a standard also polyester sewing thread, which is a plastic origin and will not dye to match your garment. So if you do decide to garment dye, you would be left with white stitches if you used a polyester thread. Now we need to identify the pieces that you're going to use to create your Helen tunic with collar. You will need the front and the back panels, the two cuff pieces, the front facing and the back facing, and finally the two collar pieces. You will of course need your sewing thread at this point, but not the two labels. Let's start by using your magic marker to highlight the notches. So the first image shows you where these notches are on the front and back panels. You will also find notches on the cuffs and on the facings. So at each notch, mark with your magic marker a 1 centimetre line into the garment so that these are clearly visible after overlocking or zigzagging. There's no right or wrong side to the fabric at this stage. So first of all, identify the front from the back panel. The front has got the V shape cut at the neck. Set your sewing machine to a straight stitch. You first need to stay stitch the curved neck edges. Stay stitching simply does as it says. It helps the fabric stay in place. Because your fabric is cut on a curve at the neck, some of the fabric runs across the bias, which is the 45-degree angle of the weave, and this has an area of stretch in it, and you need the fabric to stay square. So we use stay stitching to hold the fabric square. You need to stitch from the shoulder towards the centre of the neck on both the front and the back panels. Use a straight stitch to stitch just 5mm from the edge, as is shown in the second and the third pictures. The next job is to neaten the edges of your panels. So set your sewing machine to a wide zigzag stitch or prepare to use cotton thread on your overlocker. Neaten the edges by zigzagging the entire underarm and down the sides to the bottom of the panels and across the shoulder tops of both the front and the back. Then trim off any stray threads. Now take the front and the back panels and pin them together at the shoulders. Remember, there's no right or wrong side at this point. Sew a 1.5 centimetre seam along the shoulder. Remember to back stitch at the start and the finish to secure your stitching, and then press open with a 2-dot or medium heat iron. The next job is to attach the cuff to the sleeve edge. So open up your tunic onto a table with the right side facing up. Make sure that the edge of the sleeve is lying square, as in the second picture. The first picture shows how it may naturally lie on the table, but you need to get the edge of the sleeve parallel to the cuff. Lay a cuff on top of the sleeve edge, lining up the raw edges, and pin in place as is shown in the second diagram. Now stitch a 1.5 centimetre seam, back stitching at the start and the finish to attach the cuff to the sleeve edge. Grade the seam by trimming away half of the cuff seam allowance. Grading the seam allows for a gradual decrease in the thickness of the fabric at the seam. Now, using a medium heat iron, press the seam allowance towards the cuff. Linen can stand a higher heat, but it may slightly yellow if your iron's a little bit too hot. This should disappear after washing, but better to use a medium heat iron at this stage. The rest of these instructions concentrate on attaching the collar to the neckline of the Helen linen tunic. Please view these instructions before attaching the collar, and if you think it's a little bit too difficult for you, then revert at this stage to video 1A. You're not going to need the back facing for this version, so put this to one side. We're going to concentrate on the front V-shaped facing. Firstly, take your magic marker and using a ruler, continue the line of the outside of the V up to the corresponding notch on the top curved edge of the facing. And then picture 2 shows you how to trim off the V-shaped facing up to these 2 notches. Mark a point 3 centimetres from the bottom of the facing in the centre, just below the point of the V, and draw parallel lines 1 centimetre from the inner edge of the V of the facing. These are going to be your sewing lines. Set your machine to a wide zigzag stitch and zigzag all the way around the outer edge of this V shape. Now pin your facing to the right side of the front of your tunic, carefully lining up the V, and stitch a 1 centimetre seam following your pen line up and down each side of the V. To reinforce the seam at the V point, repeat your stitching on top of the first line of stitching, carefully spinning your needle at the point of the V, and then snip down towards the point, being careful not to snip through your stitches. Grade the seams to remove some of the thickness of the seam allowance. Turn your facing to the inside of the tunic. You need to make sure that you've got the seam right on the edge of the V. So it helps if you press with your iron the seam towards the facing before you pull the facing completely inside the tunic and then press flat. Now you're going to need your magic marker and a ruler, so get these to hand. On the right side, we're going to mark your top stitching lines using your magic marker. So draw lines parallel to each side of the V, 2.5 centimetres from the edge of the V. At the bottom of the V, draw a horizontal line 2.5 centimetres below the point of the V. Hold your facing in place with a few pins and then top stitch with a straight stitch all the way along your marked lines. Now it's time to construct the collar. Take your 2 identical collar pieces, place one on top of the other and pin all the way around the short curved edge and the 2 short straight edges. Sew a 1.5 centimetre seam all the way around these pinned edges, and then reinforce at the corners with either back stitching or stitching over the corners again before you clip the corners and grade the curved inner seam and the 2 short straight seams. Clip all around the small inner curve at inch intervals, as can be seen in the 4th image, taking care not to snip through your sewing line. To get the collar the right way round and neatly pressed, first of all, on the inside of the collar, press open the seam as is shown in the first image, and then turn the collar the right way round using a small pair of embroidery scissors or something similar to push out the corners gently so that you don't puncture the corners, and press the collar on the outside, making sure that you've got the seam edge right on the inner curve so that it's not visible either front or back, it's directly on the edge. With the collar the right way round and the tunic inside out, you now need to insert the collar inside the neck edge. It's important that you line up the edge of the collar with the edge of the V opening precisely and pin in place on the inside of the collar. So your pin's only going to go through one layer of collar. You can see in the first image my thumb is inside of the collar and this is where the pin's got to go. In the second image you can just see the pin head. The pin is attaching one layer of collar to the bodice neckline. So all the way around the neck edge now you're going to pin one layer of the collar to the tunic neck edge. Make sure that you line up the notches. A pin in each notch to start is a good idea, and a pin at each edge of the collar. Then between the notches and the collar edge or point, you need to put as many pins in as you can comfortably fit, easing the collar into the neck edge with your thumbs as I'm showing in image number 4. You need to distribute the fabric of the collar evenly into the curved edge. It's important you take your time. If you don't get it quite right, just unpin and repin until you've got the collar fabric evenly distributed around the neckline and the two edges of the collar perfectly lined up with the front opening of the V. Now, to make the process of sewing the collar onto the tunic both more precise and easier, you now need to use tacking stitch or basting stitch to attach the two pieces together, and then the pins can be removed. Now, I tend to use a contrasting thread at this stage because it is going to be removed when you've finished using the sewing machine to attach the collar to the tunic. So I've used a pale blue thread in this instance to run a long running stitch around the neckline to attach the collar to the tunic. The third image shows the collar attached to the neckline by hand using the blue tacking stitch. I've just pinned the outer layer of the collar back so that you can see the sewing line more clearly. Now, it's really tricky to start sewing the collar onto the neckline, so you need to pull out of the way the collar piece which is not attached in order to get the fabric right underneath the needle. And then you're going to sew a 1.5 centimetre seam all the way around the edge, very carefully and slowly. You need to back stitch at the start, and as you go, check and recheck that the fabric isn't getting puckered or folded underneath, that it's nice and flat and you're not going to get any folds or gathers stuck in your sewing line. When you get to the other end of the collar, make sure that you remember to back stitch right at that edge. When you've finished and you view your collar from the right side, it should look like the second stationary image. Now remove your tacking stitch and grade your seam, and then clip notches all the way around the curved edge as is shown in the third image. With your tunic inside out, press the seam allowance of the collar in towards the collar as is shown on the fourth image, and then pull the collar facing to the inside, tuck under 1.5 centimetres around the edge and pin in place all the way around the collar. The edge of your collar facing the fold at the edge should line up perfectly with the stitching line that attaches the collar to the tunic. You will get a better finish if you pin from the collar opening to the centre back, and then if you need to repin to distribute the fabric evenly, do so until you've got the collar neatly and evenly positioned all the way around the neck edge. And now you're ready to top stitch the collar on the right side. So starting at the neck edge where the collar is attached to the tunic, top stitch a line 2 millimeters from the edge on the collar all the way around, then up the short front opening edge of the collar, all the way along the top and down the other short edge front opening of the collar until you've completely top stitched all the way around the collar. This now just needs pressing on both sides, and then you're ready to move on to the second video. The second video instruction for Helen Tunic, number 2 of 2, deals with the side seams and the cuff and hem finishing.